Thanks very much, everyone. It won't be easy for Labor to win in 2016, in spite of the recent upturn of their standing in opinion polls. The Liberals will launch an anti-union onslaught, and they'll have plenty of ammunition. A compliant Royal Commissioner to Trade Unions has provided many examples, some real, some false. And in spite of real internal divisions, the Liberals, I predict, will unite around Turnbull and will pour lots of money in to stop Labor. What follows is a brief kind of broad sketch of strategy rather than a detailed nuts and bolts policy approach. My first recommendation to Labor would be bold, have courage, try something different. In the process, revise some of your existing policies. In my view, Labor's challenge is to tap a growing frustration at the inexorable rise of inequality, corporate greed, and government passivity in the face of climate change. Along the way, it needs to exploit the deep divisions within the Liberal Party between supporters of Turnbull and the hard right. My next piece of advice to Labor would be, look at what Bernie Sanders has done. By this I mean, look at the way Bernie Sanders has achieved success in many Democratic primaries. Leave aside the policy specifics for a moment, but look at his method. What he's done is to set his own agenda. He's decided to talk about the issues that others dismiss. And the centrepiece of his approach is that he talks about the disaster created by big business, or Wall Street as he describes it. By talking about Wall Street, he's connected with something in the consciousness of many Americans. They believe quite rightly that the big banks and big businesses were responsible for the great economic recession which has seen so many Americans lose their jobs and their homes. The widespread popular resentment is no secret. It's well known to many people in politics. But until now, no one will touch the issue. Because if you attack the banks and big business, then you have to actually take the next step, or journalists will ask you about the next step, which is to publicly explain what changes you'll make to the banking system or to business regulation. And that's where it gets dangerous, as Kevin Rudd found out when he tried to impose a mining tax. So in Australia, Labor needs to set its own agenda and pick up on what I call the anti-establishment vote. That is, it needs to engage in a kind of progressive populism. And by progressive populism, I mean a political stance that's centrally based on putting the needs of ordinary people first and counterposing them to the needs of the elite. If Labor can reframe the campaign in this way, they'll be on strong ground, not least because Turnbull in many ways personally epitomises the elite in Australia. In fact, it looks as if Shorten and his team are already dipping their toes into this water, and they're very carefully, rather cautiously, trying to construct a mild Australian version of progressive populism. In my view, he'll need a lot more passion and conviction than he's shown so far to make this work. And of course, Australia is not the United States, where Sanders is pitching his appeal. So what are the issues that might work in Australia? Number one, the banks are widely disliked. The Liberals will try and make a central issue about good economic management, and they'll promote scare campaigns about Labor's spending. To neutralise this and to change the agenda, Labor needs to transform the issue of economic management into a debate about the need for government protection of jobs, along with re-regulating the banks and stopping corporate tax avoidance. In terms of the banks, in the last 12 months, several major banks have been dragged before the ASIC, the regulator, accused of rigging internal interest rates. As well, the Commonwealth Bank has ripped off some of its customers who've had serious health problems and have been insured by the Commonwealth Bank. There's a whole series of scandals about financial advisors going back many, many years that I'm sure everyone's familiar with. When the government tried to regulate the financial industry last time, the banks and the finance industry more generally stepped in and made it very hard for them to do that. What emerged was a series of watered-down regulatory laws. On top of this, the combined profits of the big four banks last year topped $30 billion, a record high for what really should be just a service industry for the rest of business. When preparing this talk, I intended to call on Labor to promise a royal commission into the banking system, but obviously they're one step ahead, and they announced such an inquiry just a week ago. Shortly before they announced that inquiry, Turnbull himself made a long speech to bankers about the need for them to lift their game, and obviously the Liberals think they are very vulnerable on the behaviour of the banks. Second point, corporate tax avoidance should be a war cry for Labor. The coalition is vulnerable on tax. Its business supporters systematically minimise the tax they pay, leaving the rest of us to pick up the tab. In December, the Tax Office released a report that showed that out of more than 1,500 of Australia's largest corporate entities, 38% did not pay any tax in 2013-14. Last month, the Tax Office revealed that of the 320 companies with earnings over $200 million, 1/3 paid zero tax in 2013-14. Among the owners of these companies were the Grollo construction family and the cardboard family, the Pratts. The recently released Panama Papers show that globally hundreds of thousands of wealthy people systematically avoid tax. Of those who do that, 800 are being investigated by the Tax Office right now. So there's fertile ground for Labor to make these points. Some of the worst offenders are multinational corporations. Google has a phony marketing hub in low-tax Singapore where it sends over $2 billion in revenue, so it'll be taxed at that lower rate. Apple shifted almost $9 billion to low-tax Ireland over the past decade. The oil giant Chevron, which is very active in Australia, avoids tax through its Bermuda-based corporate structure. The cleaning company Spotless, which underpays its staff, made $2.2 billion but paid no tax. Among the biggest targets for the Tax Office is none other than Rupert Murdoch's News Corporation. Murdoch's News Australia has a turnover of $3.9 billion, with $97 million in net income last year and paid only $4 million in tax. That's about 4%. Labor needs to campaign on corporate tax avoidance because part of the coming Turnbull budget may include a cut to corporate tax. And this would form a nice counterpoint to a full-blooded Labor campaign to make the rich pay. More broadly, it's vital for Labor to challenge the framework within which tax is discussed. Too often we slip into language which talks about the tax burden and the desirability of small government. I think rather we should promote the idea that, expressed in the saying, taxation is the price we pay for living in a civilised society. Jobs, the third point, jobs are basic to most electors. The current campaign to cut the wages of weekend workers should be a launching pad for a series of arguments about jobs and conditions. Labor should argue that employers such as Coles, as well as the Business Council of Australia, are planning more attacks on lower paid workers. More broadly, Labor should reframe the debate on jobs and conditions by pointing to the consequence of deregulating Australian workplaces. For new and younger workers, jobs with paid holidays and fair wages are becoming increasingly uncommon. A casualised, cash-in-hand underclass is emerging in agriculture, retail and hospitality and beyond, often employing overseas workers. None of this is occurring accidentally, but because of economic orthodoxy is fostering a free market in labour, often through global free trade agreements. For example, the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement will allow entry to an unlimited number of temporary workers. The effect of this will be to undermine working conditions for Australians and create conditions for the exploitation of these guest workers. And we've seen many, anyone who's followed the news has seen many examples of this in recent years. Fourth point, climate change should not be just another issue. Labor should tell the truth about climate change. The Earth is warming faster than predicted and its consequences are already being felt in Australia. The Barrier Reef is bleaching. We've just had the hottest March on record in Sydney, and Sydney has had its hottest day ever in April when the temperature reached over 34 degrees. And these are just mild foretastes of what can come, according to the scientists. Australia and the world is sleepwalking to a hotter planet. British economist Lord Nicholas Stern is a very mainstream figure, not given to wild assertions. Yet in a recent book titled Why Are We Waiting?, he warns that, quote, We're gambling with catastrophe. And this is a mainstream guy who measures his words, and the words he uses is catastrophe. On reducing carbon pollution, Labor now has a much better policy. Thanks to an internal campaign by the Labor Environment Network, Labor's goal is 50% renewable energy by the year 2030. Formulating the right policy is the lesser difficulty. Convincing Australians of the dangers of unchecked climate change is much harder. And to do this again, you need the framework of progressive populism. In this instance, it means Labor needs to contrast the interests of ordinary people to that of the fossil fuel lobby of gas, coal and electricity companies. As well, it should be frank about the real dangers posed by global warming. Just to close then, there's a lot more that could be said about these issues. I'll just go through things in a series of dot points. On education, Labor should continue its attack on the deregulation of universities, which is proposed by the Coalition, $100,000 degrees, etc. But it should also publicly renounce its own policies which began this process. In particular, it should renounce its support for the privatisation of TAFE. On unions, Labor should continue to promote the institution of a federal ICAC as a counterpoint to the repressive Australian Building and Construction Commission. Another point, Labor should avoid speaking the language of spin. It should speak directly, name names, and avoid the kind of mealy-mouthed equivocation which is so common in politics today. It needs to talk in a moral language about things like greed in big business and recklessness in the face of climate change. On alliances, Labor should try and look for common ground with the Greens and vice versa. Destructive wars between two progressive parties help no one, or rather they help the opposition. Overall, Labor needs to challenge the economic orthodoxy of the market, deregulation and privatisation. On a philosophical level, Labor needs to reaffirm the common good as the basis for progressive politics. Economic policy should be based on a recognition that all people share some common interests. We're not just individuals with an enlarged sense of self-interest who are competing in a market. As I said at the start, it won't be easy for Labor to win this year, but it's amazing how quickly the gloss has worn off Mr Turnbull. Even as I was preparing this talk over the last couple of weeks, the political tide has been turning. But it won't mean much unless Labor gets its act together, is more bold and resolute. And on that basis, it could just win. Thanks.